let's get on to this morning session, session 2.1. We have 4 papers coming up, which will take us from the South China Sea to the Philippines, to Singapore, and then to Thailand. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker from Finland as well, Wesa Pertola. His talk was previewed to us from Veronica yesterday. And this morning, he'll talk to us about the Zeldan Map of China and an interesting paper about least cost path analysis using dynamic wind data. Now, if you don't know what that means, I'm sure Wesa will bring us through to it. Wesa, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Wesa Pertola, and I am currently working as a doctoral student at the University of Helsinki in a project called Ports and Harbors of Southeast Asia, Human Environment Entanglements in Early Modern Maritime Trade Networks. The project is led by Veronica Walker-Vadillo. In this presentation, we are going to take a look at how sequential least cost path analysis works, what is the Zeldan Map of China and why it is so important to our understanding of maritime trade networks in Southeast Asia, and compare the simulated sailing durations to the Zeldan map. The presentation is based on my recent article published in the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory. Southeast Asia is an interesting region in regard to maritime movement for several reasons. For example, it is situated between the cultural and economic powerhouses of China and India. It was an integral part of the maritime Silk Route, and the wind patterns in the area are highly cyclical due to the East Asian monsoon. Therefore, I decided to write my first article about simulating seafaring in the South China Sea. There are several ways how to simulate ancient seafaring. The choice is dependent, for example, on the mode of movement, drifting, paddling, rowing, sail-powered, or some combination of these, the environmental data available, and of course, the research question itself. Today, I am going to focus on directed sail-powered movement and the least cost path method, and we will shortly take a look at how the method works in ArcGIS. In the examples shown on screen from previous studies, yearly or monthly average winds were used to produce the cost distances and the least cost paths, but we will also explore how the method can be modified to use time series wind data instead. The basis of the least cost path analysis is the cost raster shown here. Cost can be, for example, energy consumption, price, or as in this case, time required to move across the cell. The cost raster can be used to calculate cost distance, in which the cell value is the accumulated cost needed to reach it from the source cell along an optimal path. When destination is defined, also the least cost path can be calculated. In this form, the analysis is isotropic. In other words, the travel costs between the neighboring cells is the same in both directions. If one considers sailing, this is not the case. It is easier to sail downwind than upwind. Therefore, a horizontal factor and the wind direction must be added to the analysis. Basically, what this means is that the wind direction is checked at each cell and the cost is changed accordingly. The horizontal factor is input as a table where the value of 1 does not alter the cost, values larger than 1 increase it, and values less than 1 decrease it, in effect making the virtual ship move slower or faster. In this study, I chose the speed in broad reach to be the reference speed against which other points of sail are scaled. The angles in the graph only go from 0 to 180, as the other half is assumed to be identical, so you would mirror the image horizontally to get the full circle. During my research, I was sadly unable to find performance values for historical chunks. Therefore, Latin satirics were used as a substitute, and the model simulates more of a generalized ship of the era. If you happen to know of such data, I would be very grateful if you could contact me later. VMG here stands for velocity made good. For example, if we want to sail here and we have to tack in order to get there, VMG is the speed that we make progress towards the goal, not the speed of the ship in an individual tack. Ships never sail as fast as the wind blows, and we only know the wind speed from satellite measurements. How do we transform it into ship speed? Based on reconstructions, the ship speed to wind speed ratios of historical ships fall typically between 0.3 and 0.5. The value of 0.4 was used in this study. And this is how we get the ascending part of the continuous line in the graph. Previous least cost path models did not have to deal with storms, as the averaging smooths them out. But here we need to define what happens to the ship speed when winds gets too rough, so this bit of the graph. And the horizontal factor mentioned before produces the other lines seen here for the other points of sail. As you can tell, the model is very simplified. It does not take, for example, the currents or the sea state into account. Models are always simplifications, and the wind speed is by far the deciding factor on the speed when using sails, and therefore other factors are often left out from sailing models. The wind data used in the study comes from the CFSR dataset. It has a decent spatial and high temporal resolution, and it goes back to 1979, which is important because wind speeds have been decreasing with the rising temperatures. And by using the older data, one is at least a little bit closer to the circumstances of early 1600s than with more recent measurements. In addition, the latest general bathymetric chart of the oceans is used for land shape and water depth information. Sea levels have been more stable, and they are used as is. In addition, the dataset is used to create extra costs for shallows and for proximity of certain island groups that are mentioned on the Zeldan map to be avoided. To make the least cost path analysis sequential and to automate the process, I wrote 2 Python macros for ArcGIS Pro. Here you can see the simplified flowcharts for both of them. I will not go to much detail here. If you are interested to check them out, they are freely available online. The first macro takes the CFSR data and processes it into wind speed and wind direction rasters that can be used in the least cost path analysis. The process is set to repeat at 6 hourly, so we get a time series of the rasters. The macro 2, in a nutshell, uses the settings discussed earlier in this presentation and the rasters created in macro 1 to do the sequential least cost path analysis. It might look more complicated than it actually is, but basically, if we, for example, consider a voyage from the red starting point to the blue destination point, the macro calculates a cost distance like this. It is generated for the whole research area, but only the first 120 hours are shown in this map. So these would fill up when we do the proper simulation. The contours here are at 6 hour intervals. The least cost path calculated from the cost distance looks like this. It is the optimal route if the wind would be constant throughout the voyage. To make the analysis sequential, the cost distance values are overlaid to the least cost path, and the segment where the accumulated cost is less than or equal to 6 hours is selected. The time used on this segment is added to the total duration of the travel, and a small time skip happens here. The duration is usually somewhat less than 6 hours, and when we will look later at the results, 2 numbers will be presented for this reason. Firstly, a duration based on accumulated cost, and secondly, duration based on full 6 hour loops. The cell with the highest accumulated cost on the segment becomes the new starting point, after which wind data is advanced by 6 hours and the process is repeated. We get a new cost distance, a new least cost path, a new 6-hourly segment, and the process is repeated until the destination is reached. For a reasonably powerful desktop PC, one 6-hour cycle on the full research area takes about 50 seconds to calculate. So this single sort voyage takes about 10 minutes of processing. To validate the model, it must be compared to known sailing durations, and this is where the Zeldan Map of China comes in. The map can be dated to the early 17th century by geopolitical events present on the map. It is not known who drew the map, who owned it, or how exactly it ended up in England already in the 1650s. The map is quite remarkable because there are sailing routes crisscrossing its seas, and it is drawn in a way that makes it possible to measure the sailing durations. The routes are a bit hard to make out, so here's a version with them emphasized and the ports used in my paper marked on the map. The compass rose on the map is situated on the top part, and it is divided into 24 compass directions in a fashion typical to Chinese compasses. The route segments on the map are accompanied by headings corresponding to these markings. The scale bar below is divided into 10 major divisions, which are again divided into 10 subdivisions. According to the current consensus, the subdivisions represent 2.4-hour ship's watches, and the major divisions refer hence to days of travel. And the scale bar makes it possible to scale the map and measure the route durations. If we, for example, consider this route, the sailing duration is 7.5 days. And the actual distance for a similar route can be roughly measured from a modern map and the average speed calculated. As you can see, the route lines do not extend all the way to the ports. The same logic is used when comparing the simulated voyages to the map. Zhuangzhou has been identified as the central port of the map. So the simulated voyages were made from there to the other ports in the South China Sea area, launching on the first day of each month. The results are shown in the table on the left, where the shortest duration for each route has been color-coded. The green ones underestimate and the orange ones overestimate the Selden map duration. If more launch days would be simulated, it is most likely that somewhat lower values would be found. The Selden map is not a high score table of the fastest voyages. That would not make sense. Instead, it most likely depicts typical durations in good conditions. If that is the case, I would argue that some underestimation is to be expected. On the map, the red colors represent the extra costs mentioned earlier, and the lines are the routes with the shortest duration. Especially in the northern part of the South China Sea, the optimal routes tend to cut through the open sea, when on the Selden map, routes tend to hug the coast in this fashion. The route Zhuangzhou Mekong Island was chosen for a more detailed study and was simulated daily throughout the year. In this graph, x-axis is the date of launch, and the y-axis denotes how many days of sailing it takes to reach the destination. The red line is the least cost path sailing duration based on a monthly mean wind for comparison. And the green and blue lines at the top are the minimum and maximum wind speeds encountered during the voyage. On this year, we get about 6 months of good and dependable sailing during the winter monsoon. There is a drastic change for the late April launch dates because the general wind direction changes very quickly in May. When interpreting the results, one has to keep in mind that least cost path analysis is not good at simulating tacking in adverse winds, and especially in the sequential analysis, routes can become quite adventurous in these conditions. Therefore, launch dates with high durations and their routes must be taken with a grain of salt, and should be understood more as time periods when sailing was less likely to be attempted. On the opposite route, there are 3 or 4 months of good launch dates during the summer monsoon, with a similar jump for the late August launch dates. If a fast turnaround time on a round trip was preferred, launching on the fastest month from Zhuanzhou might not be the optimal solution. If we assume the wind patterns for the following year to be identical and afford 30 days for unloading, loading, repair, refitting, trading, resting, etc. at the midway point, starting from Zhuanzhou nearer to the end of the winter monsoon becomes more attractive. There are, of course, other considerations as well, for example, the typhoon season or the availability of trade goods in certain times of year. Since the publication of my article, I have simulated the route between Johor and Palembang. In this case, the start and end points are set closer to the Singapore Old Harbor and the Musi River mouth than in the Zeldan map comparisons, as it was done for a different purpose. Sailing up the Musi River to Palembang is not included in the results. On this specific year, there would have been 2 months of good sailing from Johor to Palembang during the winter monsoon. One naturally must be careful not to generalize too much from the results. More years should be simulated to get a sense of the variation between them. For example, February may very well be normally a favorable month, and it just happens that on this year, for example, atypically bad sailing weather might have caused this peak here. On the opposite route, there was 4 months of favorable winds during the summer monsoon, and also on average, it was easier to sail in this direction. In conclusion, the sequential least cost path analysis seems to work reasonably well in favorable winds when compared to the Selden map, but further testing is needed in other environmental settings. The method provides a new option to the modeling of directed sail-powered seafaring of the past based on deterministic time series wind data. It can be used to estimate the sailing durations between locations that are not on the Selden map or other routers and visualize the trade winds in terms of time. With minor modifications to the code, it can be used in, for example, the Baltic Sea or the Mediterranean areas and with other types of ships. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Wesa, for that interesting paper on using modeling to predict or better model travel distances. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you later on. So we'll have all the presenters give their talks first, and then we'll have the Q&A after all the presentations have been given. So with that, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Kathryn Purnell, or Kate, who best describes herself as curious, passionate, and brave. Curious to understand herself, the world, and how it works, passionate for what she set in heart and believing, and brave to power through whatever comes her way. Kate just finished her, no, not just, but Kate finished her bachelor's in anthropology in 2018 at UP Diliman, and she later completed a graduate diploma in the UP Archaeological Studies program, where she's now taking a master's degree in archaeology. So this morning, she'll be talking to us about the prevailing art and tradition of intentional dental modification in prehistoric Southeast Asia. Kate, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Noah. Okay, so I'll just share my screen now. Okay. So can you let me know if it's seen? Can it be seen?
Yep.
Okay.
You're all good to go.
Okay, awesome. So hi everyone. Thank you so much, Noah, for the introduction. So my name is I go by Kate. So my name is Kate. I'm a master's student from the Archaeological Studies program of UP Diliman. I created this paper as part of a final requirement that I took for a class on prehistoric Southeast Asian archaeology as part of my master's program. I guess I should also put out a disclaimer that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was no fieldwork involved for me to gather the information or gather the data that I made use of for this paper, for this research. Okay. So the basis of this paper surrounds the idea that Faslich proposed, wherein historically humans have always shown a tendency to embellish themselves or to decorate themselves by either deforming or changing characteristics of their bodies. And there are very many ways in which they can do this. There are things such as foot binding, we have neck elongation, tattoos, piercings, putting on braces as well. So there's very many ways wherein embellishments happen on the body. But this paper in particular will be looking at the embellishments or decorations that are formed on teeth. So why did I choose to study teeth? Well, as per McKay et al., the teeth are some of the most durable as well as the most well-preserved artifacts that can be recovered from archaeological sites. And when we bring them together, when we collaborate with other disciplines, the studying of teeth can help us answer questions on matters including age and population health, social status and stratification, and cultural practices of both the past and the present. And so when we pertain to dental modification, we mean changes basically of the teeth that they undergo or they are observed to have. And according to Maurer, there are two possible classifications of modifications. First would be passive or unintentional modifications. These could be cases of tooth wear due to chewing, food consumption, or they can also be the tooth wearing out due to biting on tools or using the mouth or using the teeth as a third hand of sorts. The other form is perhaps what we're more familiar with, which is the active or intentional modifications, which will be the focus of this study or of this presentation. And so there are various ways wherein active or intentional dental modification can be done, and these include chipping or filing, wherein you filed into pointed shapes the teeth. There can also be coloring or dyeing or staining. These can be through the use of different plants or even other foods such as betel nut. You can also do inlaying, ablation. Ablation is the removal of teeth. There can also be plating. So there are very many ways, and some of these are covered here. But in terms of why humans attempt to intentionally modify their teeth, well, they can be summarized down to two things. First would be medical reasons. So these can be pain alleviation or things such as oral prophylaxis. Another could be social cultural reasons. So your social status, your inclusion in a group or your group identity, or it can also be conformity to beauty standards. And so this study of intentional dental modification, such as this, would give us an idea about cultural traditions of past societies. And in addition to this, it can help us assess or see which of these practices or these traditions were brought up to the present, whether changes were made to these practices, and how did these changes happen or why so as well. And so this particular study, this particular presentation looks at available documentation or literature on intentional dental modification practices that were in prehistoric Southeast Asia. And so here there will be an initial summary of patterns or practices that were used or trends as well in the region. Although at the moment, an entire compilation for this sort of research is still a bit lacking. But before I go into that, I also wanted to share several instances where dental modification has been present across the globe in different human societies for centuries. For one example is a cemetery site in Taforal, Morocco, during the Epipaleolithic period, wherein individuals that were buried in the site had a mix of both active and passive modifications. Among the Etruscans in 7th century BC, it had the earliest record of modifications that were done for aesthetics or for beauty, which were found mostly in female individuals that had gold implants placed on their teeth. Next, another good example, another very interesting example of modifications were among individuals with African origins found in Panama. So the were able to identify the origins or the migration from Africa, the African continent, to Panama, because filing and chipping practices observed on the individual's teeth were very similar to samples that were found in sub-Saharan Africa. And this showed how these particular individuals were part of the slave trade industry of European colonizers. Oopsie. All right, so just to show you a idea or a map of where my my data is coming from. So the earliest evidence of intentional dental modification in the region or in this part of Asia at least was in China around 6,500 years ago, and then after this started popping up in mainland Southeast Asia about 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. So there's about a big 2,000 or so gap in between them. And at present, however, it still remains uncertain how intentional dental modification really originated or really began in Southeast Asia. However, the ongoing theory is that it started out in southern China and present-day Taiwan, and then during the Neolithic, it moved downwards into the mainland Southeast Asia. And of the prehistoric Southeast Asian sites that were included here, 9 are from Indonesia, 8 are from Cambodia, 6 are from Thailand, 3 from the Philippines, and then 1 each from Vietnam and Lao PDR. And then in terms of temporal dates, 10 are strictly within the Neolithic period, 8 range from the Neolithic to the Iron Age, 6 are strictly from the Iron Age, and then I also included about 4 more sites from the earlier periods of the Age of Contact. And so I'll go first into the mainland Southeast Asia, starting with Cambodia. And so in Cambodia, there were several sites. However, a large number of these, so from Kokrabas until Prikmeng, all the samples from these sites were only about 1 to 2 individuals. And so there's not that wide, although there is a wide distribution across the sites, some of them don't have as many samples. Nonetheless, it was observed here in Cambodia that most of the modification practices are dental ablation or dental filing. And among teeth removal or ablation, the most common tooth that was removed were the maxillary lateral incisors and canines. And then on the mandible, on the lower part, it would be your incisors. Although it wasn't the case for all sites, there was an observation wherein some young adult individuals, so adolescents, had their teeth removed as well. So there is that implication that perhaps teeth ablation has a connection to welcoming adolescence or coming of age. In Kotameas, meanwhile, ablation was only observed in middle-aged women. So there's that demographic focus in terms of who are the ones engaging in this kind of practice. In terms of filing, however, it was practiced among all canine teeth for Pumsofai. No particular pattern for its counterpart, which was Pumsnei. And then for the other field sites wherein filing was observed, it was present for both incisors and in canines. So in terms of motivations, the research here attribute modifications to group status or internal group status. I mean, it could also be celebrating particular stages of life and then conformity to beauty standards. In Lao PDR, meanwhile, there was only 1 site that was observed with dental modifications. This is in Tam Hang, previously thought to be dated to the late Pleistocene, but more updated date now is to the Neolithic, about 2,550 BC. This sample size of Lao PDR was about 7 individuals. And the way that the modifications were observed was graded in a certain amount of range. So when it has a grade 0, it means that no ablation was found. But if it was a grade of 4, then that means that all incisors were extracted. So you can see an example of this here on the photo on the right. In Thailand, there was a significant amount of dental modifications observed, especially in Koh Phannom D and Thakay. In these 2 populations, there was a huge amount of dental ablation in particular. In Banman Chamoynkol, there was also an observation of dental ablation at about 17%. And then in Koh Phannom D in particular, because 70% of its population had dental ablation, they also were able to observe that there were 13 different patterns, of which the ablation or the selection of which teeth was being taken out. And then in terms of dental filing, however, it's a completely different story. It was only observed in Bangkok. Although based on observations of the teeth, it's more likely that the filing was not intentional. Therefore, it was only passive sort of modification. And then lastly, for the mainland, there is Vietnam. Although technically there were two sites, the site of Dabut, it's unclear whether the removal of the teeth here was intentional. And so because of that, it's still at an uncertain. But in the case of Manbak, the removal of teeth was conducted only for the maxillary lateral incisors. So your first two incisors in front. Your two front teeth, basically. So for island Southeast Asia, it's a much different story in the sense that there's much less archaeological or contextualized archaeological basis, I guess. For example, in Borneo, there's no trace of prehistoric finds. It's mostly based on ethnographic and historical records. But here they find evidence of filing, wiring, staining, coloring, plating as well, and then also dental ablation. There are also some cases, wherein dental filing was conducted together with the coloring or the staining of the teeth. In terms of motivations that present-day communities in Borneo had for modifying their teeth, it would include celebrating life stages like marriage or adolescence, welcoming to adolescence. There would also be functionality or practicality, wherein filing of the teeth helped them with hunting practices. For example, there were also reasons for medical, like oral prophylaxis. In Indonesia, meanwhile, there were selected various sites across the islands of Java, Bali, Flores, and Sumba, wherein they were able to observe dental ablation, filing, and coloring. The samples in particular in Flores were very unique only to the island, and so it's thought that there are two possibilities for this. First is that this had to be either a very old form of modification that was no longer passed down to later periods, or it's a very isolated form that was only found because it was isolated within the island. In terms of dental filing as a practice, it's still passed on today to present-day societies in Bali and Timor. And then looking at the teeth most affected by modifications in terms of ablation, it was the maxillary lateral incisors, which had various patterns, especially across East Indonesia. And then lastly would also be, of course, the Philippines, wherein here there were a lot of records from archaeology, history, and ethnography. Although earlier archaeological accounts don't really have as accurate a provenance, so it's very difficult to assess the dates behind them. However, they have been seen present across the archipelago, including Tabon Cave, Bolanao, Visayas, and Alubihid. So it's really scattered across the country. And then the practices found across the archipelago include filing, inlaying, plating, and staining. However, a lot of the modification practices were forced out of the indigenous communities due to Spanish colonization, and most of them were wiped out by the mid-18th century. Another unique, I guess, practice to the Philippines was gold pegging and gold plating, as well as the staining of the teeth due to betel nut, which both examples of which you can see to your right. Okay, so in terms of a summary, so there were 5 things that I really was able to observe from my analysis. So first and foremost is that there were no individuals or no samples that were dated to the Bronze Age in particular, which made it interesting because there were samples from both the Neolithic that came before it and the Iron Age that came after it. I'm thinking this might also just be a case of the lack of samples from the Bronze Age. And so I don't exactly say that there is a complete absence from this time period. Another is that there's significantly more evidence in mainland Southeast Asia than the island Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand and Cambodia. And so given this, I would consider exploring other geographical areas of the mainland, as well as using this research in mainland Southeast Asia to trace a concrete path of the beginnings and the rise of intentional dental modification in Southeast Asia as a region. In island Southeast Asia, most of the archaeological evidence is scattered across Indonesia, and the samples in Philippines and Borneo are dated to a much later time period. The most frequently observed practice was dental ablation, particularly of the upper front incisors. Milner and Larson theorized that this may have something to do with the front teeth being the first thing seen when an individual speaks or smiles or generally moves their mouth. And so this is a reflection of what they want other people to see from them. The motives are unclear, however, as to why these modifications are done, but it could be attributed to things such as practicality in daily activities or marking certain stages of life. The second most observed was dental filing, particularly in Indonesia and Cambodia. And although there are many varying patterns, there's no complete record as to what these particular patterns were. And so it's difficult right now to assess if there is an underlying meaning to those filing patterns. And if we look at ethnographic accounts, especially in the cases of Borneo and the Philippines, oftentimes filing is paired with the blackening of teeth as a way of soothing the pain that comes with the filing of the teeth. In terms of motives, these could be attributed to beauty standards, a rite of passage to marriage, for example, and then also the maintenance of oral health. And then one last modification that was notable across Southeast Asian region was the plating placed on the teeth, particularly of metals like gold, as was seen in the Philippines. And so in terms of conclusions, one thing to take into account is that the continued prevalence of intentional modifications could be associated with what Scott and Turner theorized of the mouth acting as both a social and a biological organ, wherein modifications that are done to the mouth, in particular to the teeth, may reflect a community's values, beliefs, and cultural practices. There are various ways that this modification is done across Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. However, in prehistoric Southeast Asia in particular, we see an extensive presence geographically and temporally. However, acknowledging that there are still so many gaps, like the absence of Bronze Age samples, as well as a still lacking representation of island Southeast Asia. And then most frequently practiced forms of modification really include ablation, filing, coloring, and plating, although how or why these are done can only be supported for now by ethnographic accounts. So I also had some recommendations that I noted in terms of how the study could be carried forward, and these include contextualizing ancient population health with the study, as well as considering the variable of migration in the presence of some of these dental modification practices in sites. And so studies on intentional dental modification remain relevant because they help us understand not just cultural aspects of the lives of past humans, but also to assess both the continuity on and the discontinuity of these traditions into modern day forms of body modification, art, healing, self-expression, and identity. So thank you so much for listening. I can't wait to hear what questions that you might have later on. And then if we don't have enough time later, I'll also drop my email here as well in case you want to know more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that very toothy presentation, showing us how many gaps there are in the research. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So before I go into more puns, let's introduce our next speaker, Ms. Sxuann Sim, who is pursuing her master's at Nanyang Technological University Archaeology Lab in Singapore. She aids in the drafting of reports on historical and archaeological materials, and she's previously dabbled in bioarchaeology before in Taiwan. Right now, her work focuses on materials from colonial Southeast Asia, colonial Singapore, and she will present to us her talk on the still unexplored parts of Southeast Asian archaeology, colonial archaeology in Singapore. This is a pre-recorded video presentation, but she will join us for the question and answers later.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I would like to first say a huge thank you to SPAFA for organizing this year's SPAFACon, and also a happy 50th anniversary to them. I am honored and thankful to be here today. It is my first time presenting at a conference, and although it is unfortunate that we're not able to do this in person, but thankfully for our technology, we're still able to do this via Zoom. I am also pre-recording this because my internet connection and my background noise can get quite disruptive sometimes. So it's better to be safe than sorry to just have pre-recording. I would also like to thank the speakers before me, Wesa Pertola and Kathryn Purnell. Although I'm pre-recording this, I am sure their presentations are amazing, judging from the title itself. So before I actually really start, let me first introduce myself briefly. I am Sxuann. My name is Sxuann. I'm currently pursuing my master's at Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, in short, NTU. So this is not to be confused with the NTU in Taiwan or in the UK. I have also a wide range of research interests. They include archaeology, art and heritage conservation, and historiographical practices of the region. My current research actually focuses specifically on the 19th to 20th century European porcelain excavated from Istana Kampong Glam in Singapore. And today I am presenting on colonial archaeology, something that I feel personally there is a lot of enormous potential for the development of this field, especially in Singapore and also in Southeast Asia. Let me change the slide. Yes. So before we proceed, I think it is also important for us to first answer what exactly do we mean when we say colonial archaeology, right? There are a couple of definitions out there, but to put it simply, I think colonial archaeology can be best defined as the study of time and place of European rule over non-European land. And the colonial period obviously differs from country to country, but typically in Southeast Asia and in Singapore, it happens sometime between the 19th century to the 20th century. And since colonial archaeology does fall within the historical period, it is also sometimes grouped under its bigger umbrella, which is historical archaeology. Yes. And what is interesting perhaps is the fact that despite the availability of historical records and colonial records and archaeological records during this period, we do see a lack of archaeological research conducted during this particular period in Singapore and also in Southeast Asia. And most of the archaeological studies in Southeast Asia tend to focus more on the prehistoric period, especially during the Paleolithic, Bronze, and Iron Ages, or are typically part of a larger national historic preservation effort that typically range from the 19th to 14th century. And although, but what is interesting is that current colonial archaeological studies done in Southeast Asia and also in Spanish colonial archaeology has shown that archaeological records do present information that goes beyond the written records. And sometimes it actually contradicts what is documented in the written record. And it has also shown that colonization in the region had a very different impact across Southeast Asia and across different indigenous communities. And according to Myram Stuck, this can sometimes seem quite surprising to some, because some people do consider some people do consider the region Southeast Asia to be quite a homogeneous area, which of course we know by now it is not. And naturally, the impact of colonization is different from country to country and also across different groups within the country itself. Yeah. I've provided a couple of archaeological studies in my paper that I find personally extremely useful because of the similarities in the materials that they study. But because of the time constraint, I will only talk about two papers that I have selected. So the first one being Yuda's, I'm butchering the pronunciation, I'm sorry, at all. Paper that looked at the archaeological materials at Banten, such as the imported ceramics and fauna remains, to really understand how and when did Banten Sultanate power decline. And previous studies on the decline, studying the decline of this alternate power, actually really mostly relied on Bantian's change in monumental architectural styles with the increase of Dutch forts to determine when the decline actually happened. But it was believed that through those studies, it was believed that the loss of the Sultanate's power was actually more of an immediate one after the Banten was ceded to the Dutch. However, through the archaeological records themselves, it has shown that the Sultanate's decline actually happened a lot more gradually than what was previously anticipated and expected. Because the Sultanate and the palace actually continued to receive and consumed prestigious goods even after becoming a vassal state. And another study that I found that was really interesting was also how an archaeological study on Presidio Santa Maria aided in our understanding of alternative economies during the Spanish rule. And from the Spanish colonial records, it was documented that the settlement itself only actually received 5 shipments of ceramics. However, the abundance of ceramics found at the sites actually contradicted what was recorded in the official historical records, which also demonstrated that people were participating in alternative economies. So both Ueda's and Thompson's studies have shown, the potential and significance of looking at the archaeological record. And for Ueda, it has shown that the decline of the Banten Sultanate actually was more complex than it seemed, while Thompson's study actually provides us actually a way of potentially understanding alternative economies, which will not have been revealed if not for the archaeological records. And what they do share in common, personally, I feel, is the fact that, they show that colonial archaeology itself do allow us to better understand the roles that individual and groups played in negotiating their places during the colonial rule, which is often not really written in the written records itself. Please do really take a look at the papers themselves to understand the potential of the field that we can have, the potential of the field, basically. Yes. Moving on to Singapore archaeology or archaeology in Singapore. Archaeology in Singapore has come quite a long way since the first ever systematic dig conducted at Fort Canning in 1984, led by the current Emeritus Prof. Professor John Mixie. The excavation also proved, that the then urban legend and myth of a palace site in Singapore during the 14th century was true. Further excavation across Singapore further confirmed that there was indeed an occupation layer in the 14th century Singapore. I'm not sure if you can see, but there is a picture I've included a picture of volunteers working at EMP and also a map next to it, showing the distribution of 14th century sites on Fort Canning, which is a courtesy from Professor Mixie's Silk Road of the Sea. I've also included a couple of pictures of the 14th to 16th century artifacts that have been excavated across Singapore. As you can see from the slide, we do see Chinese stoneware, porcelain, Sukhothai porcelain, glass beads, and also locally produced earthenware. And you can find all of these pictures and artifacts and more information about them on Southeast Asian archaeological site reports on NUS Press if you are interested. Yes. But what is perhaps not really talked about is, or studied about, is colonial archaeology. And the fact that, people don't really know, I guess, that we do have 4 main occupation layers in Singapore as well. So layer 1 actually dates to the contemporary period, layer 2 dates to the 19th to 20th century, which is the colonial period, layer 3 dates to the 14th to 16th century, and layer 4 is sterile. So existing archaeological studies in Singapore actually have typically focused on the 14th to 16th century, which is the layer 3, and while colonial archaeology in Singapore remains notably understudied. And although, as mentioned before, the presence of colonial records can provide us information on colonial Singapore, but more mundane activities and lives of local inhabitants continue to be underdocumented. Colonial archaeology in this case can be used to supplement existing records, And currently, there have not been any comprehensive studies done on the colonial assemblage in Singapore, despite the number of archaeological sites and artifacts that we do find. And just to give you guys a better understanding, the table on the left shows a summary of the excavations conducted in Singapore over the last couple of years. And I highlighted those in red, basically the ones boxed in red are the ones basically that we do see 19th century colonial artifacts in them, in those particular sites. So there is a lot of sites. Yeah. Perhaps I think what is interesting is also to think about where we should be heading towards and how we should really study the colonial materials in Singapore. And for starters, I would recommend personally because since ceramic continue to dominate the assemblage in Singapore, as you can tell from the pictures, we do really see quite a fair bit of ceramics. Ceramic studies is definitely one of the many ways to go about studying, I think, the colonial records. Existing 19th to 20th century ceramic catalogs have also tend to mostly focus on collectibles that are really not very reflective of local inhabitants' ceramic consumption. Studying ceramics, therefore, would also then allow us to better understand consumption centers, which is also understudied. And during the 19th to 20th century, this was also a period of mass production in pottery factories. They increasingly took over the production of ceramics. Studying consumption centers in Singapore who really enjoyed a wide range of imports from China, Japan, Europe, and Southeast Asia would therefore also further allow us to understand the production, distribution, and consumption patterns of just local inhabitants. Yeah. And additionally, due to the lack of research in colonial archaeology in Singapore, there is also a need for us to create a comparable and standardized terminology, typology, and methodology. Having standardized terminology and typology is important, considering that it does allow archaeologists to not only compare similar sites with one another in Singapore, but also across Southeast Asia. And standardization is very important as it also allows archaeologists to really understand each other's criteria. Yeah. So this is not really in my paper, but I thought it would be interesting to show you guys an example of the colonial artifacts that we do find in Singapore. So this is taken from the site CCT Colombo Court in Singapore. I will mainly be focusing on the ceramics finds because, again, like I said, there's a lot of ceramics, and due to the time constraint, I will not be covering other materials, but we do have other materials. We have metals, we have organic materials, we also have a really wide range of materials too. So that's a topic for another discussion. Yeah. So from the slide, I've included a couple of pictures of the ceramics that we do see. So I've labeled them in 1 to 8. And yeah, I've labeled them 1 to 8. And those in yellow are actually the ones from Europe. The ones in red is from Japan, and the ones in blue are from China. Yes. As you can see, number 1 is probably, maybe you guys can identify number 1. Number 1 is actually a famous blue and white transfer printed blue willow plate, which is also one of the most popular Chinoiserie design that is still being produced today. And interestingly, the European ceramic assemblage at CCT consists mostly of transfer printed ware, which was very interesting, considering that a potential explanation might be the fact that transferring prints to pottery actually significantly reduced the cost of porcelain production and the time spent hand painting this motif, which was a common technique in China. And this technique actually allowed the Europeans to produce pottery at a faster and cheaper rate. And however, there were also other decorative motifs that were found used on European wares that were found in Singapore, such as sponge printed ware and hand painted ceramics. So this is just really a potential, way we can understand the ceramics assemblage itself. Yeah. Similarly, we do also see Japanese porcelain in CCT, Number 5 is a picture of Imari porcelain. So like Europe, Japan was also producing wares such as blue and white, enamel and polychrome enamel wares for export. They tend to also have a richer decoration of floral and other motifs that tend to be adapted from Chinese porcelain. And porcelain production in Japan also increased drastically during this period. So other imported ceramics that we do see in our colonial assemblage at CCT also include stoneware and earthenware from Europe, China, and Southeast Asia. So obviously further testing is needed to determine the actual provenance and chemical composition of the wares. And let us also not forget that during this period, we do also see local kilns producing ceramics for the local inhabitants, which is an additional area that we can explore. Yes. So I'd like to conclude here. Naturally, I think one of my goals today is to raise the importance and potential, to raise the awareness, the importance and the potential for colonial archaeological records. Colonial archaeology is important, I feel, because it allows us to understand how local communities played, how local communities play in negotiating their places during colonial rule. Historical records of the period tend to also only be documented by colonizers themselves, and history on historical records alone cannot really provide an accurate representation of history of the communities who were colonized. And in colonial Singapore, the day-to-day activities of local inhabitants were not really recorded. In fact, we don't really know much about the different groups of people living in Singapore during the colonial period. And ceramic studies are particularly useful in this aspect, considering that ceramics not only continue to dominate our assemblage, but they also can provide us information about inhabitants at a site. So they can potentially also review social stratification within a site and also more utilitarian functions of ceramics. And due to the lack of research in colonial archaeology in Singapore, there is also a need for us to create a more standardized typology, terminology, and methodology that is replicable for future researchers in Singapore and also in Southeast Asia. Yes, and that's it for today. If you guys have any questions that we might not have time to answer, please do feel free to email me. I will reply them whenever I can. And thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Sxuann, for that presentation on colonial archaeology in Singapore. Many of you know that I come from Singapore myself, and so it's nice to see a bit of home as well. And I'm sure we'll have questions for Sxuann after our next presentation, which will be our last for this morning's session. For our next speaker, we have Dr. Pakpadi Yukongli from the Fine Arts Department in Thailand. In fact, the Fine Arts Department is SPAFA's next door neighbor, so she's probably broadcasting from us from next door. So I'm waving to her right now. So Dr. Pakpadi will be presenting to us a paper about Khao Sandam, the archaeological evidence of burnt rice festival in southern Thailand. Dr. Pakpadi, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hello and good morning again, everyone. I present this topic as part of the regional of Fine Art Department of Songkhla, because they found some sites, some archaeological sites that have a good object, that is Khao Sandam or carbonized rice. They report that they found carbonized rice at two sites. One is Khao Kuram archaeological sites in Hue Yot district in Trang province, and another site is Napra archaeological site, Mueang district in Trang province as well. So these two sites is near site number 7 in Hanwat Saman report in the SPAFA conference the third SPAFA conference, which I already report last few years. If someone have already been there or read that report, you also can see in here, somewhere here in Trang province. And these two sites is nearby number 7. So the Napla archaeological sites, they found that there are a lot of the area, the area of sites is located on one side of the hill slope, where were suited for the habitation and plantation, especially tiny paddy field and farm with sufficient water supply. You can see there is a small hilly area, and there's also a flat plain that quite suitable for paddy field, somewhere like this. And you can see from the aerial photo, here is Napla sites, and here is Khao Nui. And paddy field is all around the area. Next slide, please. The archaeologists found one monument. Actually, the people in that area report that the irrigation office that dug this the irrigation canal and found a monument somewhere around here. So we have to have a excavation pit to excavate in this area to restore this monument. Then next year after that, in 2019, we excavate another test pit somewhere nearby and found a rice grain in the habitation layers. In this excavation, the associated file is the Avalokiteswara. Next slide, please. But this Avalokiteswara is interpret that is a local caste. It's not from the outside. I mean, it's not abroad, or it's not from the India. However, there are other artifacts found like potsherds, then grinding stone, then beads, animal bones, etc. Next slide, please. Another site nearby is Napla. Napla archaeological sites, also they found carbonized rice. And I have compared this rice with the rice that they found in Phnom Surin shipwrecks in central Thailand. I think these all seeds are shorter when compared to the rice that already been real studied by the botanists, archaeologist. I think this one is surely Orissa sativa or indica rice. And when I compare to the modern rice, which still plant in the, I mean, in the area where there is a very shortage of water in the hilly area, we call it Khao Rai. And still, they still plant this kind of rice. The archaeologists in Songkhla that have sent this rice to check the dating at the beta by AMS standard calibrate dating is about 1440 plus minus 50 BP. So it's about 14th century. Even though it is quite, I mean, in the historic period. Next, please. Then at Khao Kuram, also it is carbonized rice, but they cannot send the rice for check the dating. They send the char material in the same soil level actually. The dating is quite later, is 1640 plus minus 30 BP. Next, please. Then once we come to the map and we check where is the site of Khao Kuram and Khao Nui. You can see that Khao Nui is here and Khao Kuram is very near to the Khao Nui. Khao Nui, we found a votive tablet of this group is and compared to the site at Yarang is about 13th to 14th century Buddhist era. Then Khao Kuram, we found the same period of object like this. So these two sites is these were in the same period. So the date of the char material is quite okay, I think, and the carbonized is almost correct. I mean the dating is okay. I think it's quite good, correct. Next slide, please. Then once I try to compare this char material with some ethnic group, I found this right, and the ethnographic group in Meghalaya of India. The group is called themselves Atong. is one of 12 subtypes of the Garo Tibeto-Burman of India. This is they were originate slash and burn social group which shown a growing rice activity. It's very interesting group. Next slide, please. There are some ritual ceremony for planting of paddy. I try to understand them. There few ritual ceremony that very interesting for me. The first one is they use flattened rice by asking for permission to cultivate the land from the first harvesting paddy in May. May is when the first raining come. Like in Thailand, we also have a kind of a ceremony in May when the first raining come also. So the second is after the harvesting in September or October. The first ceremony of the agricultural year is a Thanksgiving ceremony to mark the end of the period of toil in the field and harvesting of bumper crop. It says something like that, which is probably the most important festival of the Garo, locally called Maidan Sila, mean to celebrate the after harvested festival or burn rice festival. That is make me very much to learn about the Maidan Sila. Maidan is some kind of the word Mai in Thai. So I go deeper in a Tong English dictionary. I found the word, this one, Mai in or Maidan Sila is mean the celebrate the after harvesting festival. And Mai, there is two meaning. Mai relate if you go close to thresh the rice with your feet so as to separate the grain from the oars, to separate. And one thing, Mai, after harvest festival. So it's almost clear that it means make it black. For me, Mai is mean like in the word in Thai is burned. Then the third ceremony is to revive the monsoon cloud. People throw cooked rice on the floor to symbolize hailstone. What's the meaning hailstone? Hailstone means dark. So they may use some kind of this Mai rice or dark rice to symbolize the hailstone. So I think this one is probably the dark rice or khao san dam of this one, the maize rice or cooked rice to symbolize hailstone. So I think this one probably khao san dam in many activities of these ceremonies. In archaeological remain in Khao Kuram or Naprak, probably. This is what I try to interpret these artifacts. Next, please. So, come to southern Thailand. There are, many archaeologists try to study it in southern peninsula, like Thai and French archaeologists study in Chumphon, Takuapa and then isthmus, and quite certainly sure that there are some Indian origin and merchant settled there in Thai peninsula already since first millennium BP. So I think after that, many Indian people have already settled down here. However, there are many people have, many people come and settle many times. Then there are many culture have already come along with them. And there are one thing that still remain, that is this kind of activity that still show their way of life. That is they call it Bundenship, or during September or October, they have one culture. They will prepare their food and give to the ancestor. During September to October, they will prepare four main dish made of rice, and then put in the map and give to the ancestor. This is a kind of animism, but usually they do this this tradition during after harvesting. But if you ask them nowadays, they don't know. But in deeper detail, it is after the harvesting. Then after that, they change to Buddhism. They merge this tradition to Buddhist tradition to the after the Buddha went to visit his mother in the Dawadung and came back. That time is the same time we call it. That was after the 10 lunar months. This you will see all these come together with the we call it Bundenship in the temple of the temple in southern part of Thailand. And anyway, even in the northeast of Thailand, they also Bundenship in northeast also. It's the same thing, same culture, but they have different kind of rice, of thing that give to the monk or give to the ancestor, but it's a same kind of animism. But you may ask why the khao san dam or the carbonized was missing. I think because after harvesting, after October or September or October, why this time there's no more hailstone for them, because it's already monsoon period. So when people move from the west to settle in Southeast Asia, it's become the land of the land of fruitful. So no need to use any kind of no need to use this kind of tradition anymore. So hailstone or Khao San Dam is also a little bit lost. Next slide, please. Anyway, but in South, you can find that in this place, the Napla still become the name of Napra still use this become the place name of the site still since Bangkok period, because the Napra is mean rice sprouting, especially for monk or temple. The name Napra is in the old archive showed here. Ban Napra is mean rice for the monk or field for the monks since Bangkok period, King Rama II, something like that. Next, please. However, this after harvested festival or burn rice festival also found in the northeast region. I tried to find it. I found one site in Non Bang Cha in Upper Moon Valley. I think excavated by Charles Hyam recently, and found some in Ban Wai and Ban Hoi Pong in Lom Sak district. This is found many years ago, I mean more than 10 years ago in historic sites. This one in the Warawadi Mode Town at Dong Lakorn in Nakhon Nayok. Some archaeologists told me that it is they try to find out that it is carbonized or not, but it's not really carbonized. It's probably one kind of just brown rice only. So I may conclude that the burnt rice of Khao Phuram and Napra archaeological sites had already dominated during early historic period, or about AD 1000 to 1100, and then the southern Thailand was a transitional part of rice cultivation from the west, from Indian subcontinent to the east. They may go to, pass from south to northeast to central Thailand, and then lost because of there's no need for this kind of tradition anymore, and carbonized rice or Khao San Dam has stopped and never used in other part of Southeast Asia, and you cannot find any carbonized rice in Vietnam or in Cambodia or any other seashore site, archaeological sites along or sites, any site along the coast of South China Sea. That's all. Thank you.
So can I thank you, Dr. Pakpadi, for the presentation. So may I ask all our presenters for this section to come on the video? I have some questions to start with. Firstly, or I'm going to go with Sxuann first. Can you explain to us how colonial archaeology has changed our understanding of the historical record in Singapore? Give us an example, sorry.
An example. The thing is, we only really started looking at colonial archaeology materials, like I think last year. So it's still quite in a preliminary sort of analysis stage. But I think in Singapore, at least for the CCT side, I think even the colonial records themselves, if we were to really look at the colonial records about the different sites and their functions, right, it's not really that well documented. So the site that I'm currently looking at is Istana Kampong Glam also. And it's quite interesting to see that, you know, from the colonial records itself, they don't really talk much about what's documented in the Sultan's daily life, like the daily activities or even rituals and everything like that, or just what the things they were importing and stuff like that. So it's not really documented. But from the current ceramic assemblage, we can see quite a couple of things actually. And we do find also, I think one of the most interesting one was crucible that we found at Istana Kampong Glam, which suggests that there's some sort of metal working in there, but again, it's still in a very preliminary stage. So more research is needed for that. Yeah.
All right. I have a follow-up question to that, because you just mentioned Istana Kampong Glam, which for our audience outside of Singapore, this is a historically Malay enclave. Istana Kampong Glam is in fact the castle, no, the Sultan's palace.
Yeah,
that's right, palace is the right word. Do you expect to find differences in the assemblage according to ethnic enclaves? So do you expect to find a Chinese area will have different ceramics, and a Indian area will have different ceramics with a Malay area?
I think naturally, I do expect it, but again, I have to really look at the records to see. But yeah, I mean, if we were to compare with Pulau Saigon, which is not really an enclave per se, but we do see a lot more Chinese porcelain there. And then in IKG, it's still under study. We are still studying it, so we do see more. We still see quite a bit of European porcelain as well. So it's quite interesting. So again, I have to research and we'll see for my thesis. You can check out that, yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, so that's something interesting to look out for, and of potential for future archaeological research in colonial archaeology, not just in Singapore, but something to think about for our audience out there, if you might be interested in this in the future. I have a question, another question for Kate. What percentage of the dental modifications that you see, what percentage do you see them as functional as opposed to just decorative?
Okay, I think a very small percentage. It's hard to give an actual amount, but from the literature that I see, at least the ones that are definite, I guess, in what the modifications are for, I think most of them are more of an indicator that they're part of this group or they're part of this community, and also like an aesthetic thing more than the actual practicality aspect. The practicality aspect, it was only really considered for the accounts in Borneo. So yeah.
Speaking of Dr. Pakpati, thank you, Kate, for your answer. Speaking of Dr. Pakpati, how do we know that the burnt rice remains that you talked about, how do we know that they are part of a festival? And because you mentioned that they were part of a burnt rice festival, and how do we know that they were part of a festival and not just part of some other normal discard or just disposal of rice?
I searched from the from the word burn rice. I've searched in the Google burn rice. Then I found burn rice first festival. It is found in the book of 12-month ceremonies of the King Rama V. There is one ceremony, is a burn rice festival in the third lunar month. This already mentioned for in Thailand. We mentioned this festival already, but it's already missing. And I also found this rice in Phetchabun province. We know that we have this kind of burn rice in archaeological fields. Then when we found it in Trang province, in these two sites, is my doubt, my question. What happened to this kind of artifacts? So I searched, then I found it is kind of festival. So it was in Khao, group. And then this is my next thing to do is go to that site. Go to the Khao to Makladaya in India to check it. Is it correct or not? That what I try to check. To classify, to identify it, to interpret it. Is correct is or not? But quite sure because my in Thai is burned. Is same word. And this group is Tibeto-Burman group is half Mongoloid, half Negroid. I'm not sure who they are. When we see the group, the ethnic group, I think they are quite the same as us.
Thank you. For Wesa, I've got a question about your, I don't know whether you call it an algorithm, but your Python script, is it a plug and play thing? And how do we, as an external researcher who would like to use your script, get to use it?
Yeah, the macros are freely available online. If someone is interested, I can post you a link to the macros. And I guess if you want to modify the macro, you would need to have some knowledge of Python to do it. But I am not a professional coder myself, so it is not too complicated to do that. And again, I can help you with the stuff if you contact me.
Did you learn to code the script by yourself?
Yes.
That gives me much.
So I actually started doing Python like last autumn, like a year back. I had coded some other macros for map info and stuff like that, so I didn't start from zero. But it's not too complicated, the macros.
That's good to know. I tried to learn Python last year and I could not get past 20 hours. So
okay.
Okay, with that, I think I'm going to call the session to an end over here. I see that Sxuann and Kate has answered the questions online already for me. In which case, then I should end the session here, and then we will come back again in 13 minutes for session 2.2. So again, thank you very much for your interesting presentations. I wish you all well, and I hope you'll join us and stay with us for our next session, where we will go to Myanmar, Malaysia, and Vietnam.